Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews. We're an evangelical encounters the restoration. As you can tell, folks, this is a very, very special Halloween episode of Mormon Book Reviews. And just in case, yes, I think we all know the Mormon connection, Napoleon Dynamite, the whole thing. And just so you know, Jared Hess, my buddy, you promised me, creator of Napoleon Night, that you're going to come on my program. I hope this attracts your attention. So, Jared, let's get together soon and we'll do our conversation about Mormonism. I'm looking forward to that. Before we get started with our interview, I just want to do a little housekeeping. First of all, the deadline for the book, this month's book giveaway, the North American model for the Book of Mormon from Jerusalem to Cumorah, from my friend William Midgley. He gave me a second copy so to be given away. So just make sure that you, to enter the book drawing, you just put your mormonbookreviews@gmail.com, put in the subject heading book contest, and give your name and address. This is only for U.S. residents only. Okay, this is a special Halloween episode. Why am I having Derek Hutchins on? Because he wrote a book called The Resurrection Box, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do that, Derek, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So you're dressed as a pirate?
Yes, I am.
Any pirate in particular? Or just generic pirate? Okay, so generic pirate. Okay, all right, very good. So I wrote this book. Now, this book just came out on October 21st, 2022. And it's called The Resurrection Box, A Tale of Mormon Horror. Now, I want to read the first paragraph in the description here because I've read this to a few people and they said, I want to get that book. And it goes like this. After the polygamous wife of a local miner loses her only child in a freak accident, she quickly spirals into despair. She is saved by a vision, which she believes is meant to send her on a quest into the mountains near her Mormon settlement to find a magic coffin which has the power to bring her son back to life. That's quite a hook, dude. And it's subtitled A Tale of Mormon Horror. You are a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and you intended this book to be for a faithful LDS audience. Is that correct?
That is the primary demographic. That's correct. Yeah, it is written. I do like kind of go into a little bit of history just so if anyone else is interested and they pick it up, they can have an understanding of, the idea of the church and the history of it and understand the story. But yeah, primarily I'm a believing member of the church and it's geared towards that audience.
And is this the first horror novel that you've written?
So I wrote this under a pen name, Declan Hyde, because I think this is for marketing purposes, this is geared towards a different audience. But I do write under my real name, Derek Hutchins. I've written a few other novels and short stories and stuff like that.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. And are you kind of following like Stephen King when he wrote under a pseudonym a little bit too?
A little bit, yeah, yeah.
That's great. Well, before we talk about the book, I thought what we could talk about is just kind of like your influences. You're somebody who enjoys the horror genre. You like to watch movies and read books. Tell me some of your influences in this realm.
Yeah, well, for this one specifically, it's obviously influenced by Mormon history. Porter Rockwell, there's a character that's directly inspired by Porter Rockwell in the book. It's inspired by aspects of LDS folklore. For those who are familiar with the Bigfoot as Cain myth, they'll be pleasantly surprised when reading this, I think. And then we mentioned Stephen King. He's a big influence for me. The supernatural horror aspects of it. There's monsters in here, so there's lots of influences kind of being mixed in here.
And it's my mom read the book and she said that she enjoyed it. She thought it was well written. And she thought the ending was a little abrupt, but she figured that was probably intentional. But if anything, she probably just wanted more, which is a sign of a good book. That hey, I want to read more about these characters and everything like that. And do I've talked to other producers who like the horror genre, like Spanky Ward. I had him on last year. He's dabbled with that, and it's so fascinating to me because a lot of people don't realize now this is a Halloween special, and some people think Halloween is this satanic holiday and all that kind of stuff. And I acknowledge I have a neighbor that feels that way, but I also want to talk about the important role that Christianity has played on the horror genre, and we can circle back and we can talk a little bit more about your book as well. But I want to just talk about overall the idea, like for instance, one of the scariest movies of all time, The Exorcist, was made by devout, believing Catholics. And if we also want to look at the imagery that is used in Stephen King novels, it's full of Christian imagery. why don't we just talk about maybe some of the Christian influences on the horror genre overall?
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. So this is something I've thought about a lot as a horror fan and as a Christian. The relationship between horror and Christianity. A lot of Christians tend to shun horror, as you mentioned, and even at times those who like it. And I feel like a lot of horror fans may not feel welcome in Christianity because of that. But in my opinion, the two are intricately connected. The most epic dichotomy is between God and the devil, right? And you mentioned The Exorcist, which is, these two facing off. You can't have, I mean, Christianity is built around this idea that there is an opposition. There is, a darker side, you know, God and Jesus Christ represent the light, and then there's the devil, which represents the darkness, and they're always at odds. And we're kind of caught in the middle in this world here. So
Yeah,
there's
the battle
a
of
lot.
good, classic battle of good and evil, which is so
Exactly.
often really at the core of most horror movies and books.
Yep. Yeah, and there's a whole nowadays there's a resurgence of Catholic horror. We got The Exorcist, we got a bunch of exorcism movies.
Hmm.
The Nun, the Conjuring universe is kind of built off those ideas. Um, so I just wanted to throw my hat in the ring and do some Mormon horror. Get some different perspectives in there.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
And it's interesting because of course Mormonism brings its own kind of ideas and theology to the table.
yeah.
Can you maybe talk about some Mormon ideas that might have made their way into the book or perspectives and stuff like that?
Yeah. So this is very much it takes place in 1860s in Utah, which is right after the pioneers moved out west. Which is it's the high point of polygamy in the church. That's when I was trying to think of an idea to write about this Mormon horror idea. I thought about what kind of character I wanted to write about, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I wrote about a polygamous wife? I feel like that's something we don't see a lot, especially within the horror genre. So I thought it'd be a fun challenge to write this character and um, try to make the audience sympathize with them and care about them. So that's one of the main Mormon aspects to it. But there are also other ideas. They're kind of being hunted by a group of people who are antagonistic towards the church, which is something that I mean every Christian religion has their own antagonists, but that's something that's unique to Mormonism to the extent that people were, there was an extermination order and that kind of thing. Um, and then I also wanted to incorporate aspects of LDS folklore. So I mentioned the Cain is Bigfoot story, which I incorporate in here.
That is really cool to hear.
Yeah,
That's so awesome. The Cain is Bigfoot. That's one of my favorite Mormon folklore stories, man.
yeah, yeah.
That's so cool. So are you saying that Bigfoot makes an appearance in your book?
He makes an appearance. I'm not going to say he's the driving point of the story, but he's in there. Yeah,
That is so cool.
yeah.
Awesome. And then what let me ask you what was your inspiration, like what made you decide to write this book? Like how did the idea first germinate in your head about this story? When did this story start appearing in your mind?
Yeah. Well, I've always been interested in horror and I've always been interested in writing. So when I really started writing more horror, and this is something that was always in the back of my mind, is how can I incorporate my faith into my writing in a way that's not too preachy. And I was getting more involved in the indie horror community online on Twitter, and I saw a post for a open call for an anthology that you could submit short stories to it, and the topic was religious horror. And I thought, okay, this is my chance to submit and write an authentic Mormon horror story and kind of represent my faith in that way. So I started thinking of ideas. And one idea I had that was top of the list was an idea about a coffin that could bring the dead back to life. And I thought, well, there's definitely some parallels there with Christianity, the ideas of resurrection and that kind of thing. And, it would be a Western. I would have this image of an old Western kind of coffin and started thinking, how can I write this? And so I kind of started there.
And it sounds like maybe a little bit of Stephen King's Pet Cemetery influence there too.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's my favorite Stephen King book. So
Oh, okay. And as a matter of fact, I think I remember reading that I think it's Pet Cemetery that Stephen King almost didn't publish the book because he thought it was just too scary.
yeah, it's definitely, yeah, his he calls it his darkest book. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you that movie gave me the creeps in high school, man. So
Yes.
yeah, and that is so interesting because I so often think that when I read, the only actually let me give you a little story. I don't really read a whole lot of fiction. I'm pretty much a
Mhm.
nonfiction guy.
Yeah.
But I did read a novel when I was about 16 years old called It, and I have to tell you, I could not put the book down.
Yeah.
Afterwards, I thought, I don't think I could ever read another Stephen King book again. That thing
Yeah.
freaked me out.
Yeah. Yeah. He's good at what he does.
It
He's
sure
famous
is.
for losing.
So let me ask you, what are some of your favorite horror books and horror movies?
Oof. We could talk about this all day, but horror books. My favorite horror book is called Hell House by Richard Matheson. People may be more familiar with his I Am Legend. He's the guy who wrote I Am Legend. Um, but Hell House is my favorite that he wrote, and it's about a group of paranormal investigators that go investigate this haunted house, which is kind of a typical setup for haunted house story. But the difference here is that it's pitched as the Everest of haunted houses, and so like people who go in there like literally die. So they're fighting for their lives in this haunted house, and it's like the best haunted house book I've ever read. So I highly recommend that. Movies. I actually went to film school, so I'm a big movie buff. I probably know more horror movies than I do books. But one of my favorite horror movies is called It Follows. Um, I'm a big fan of what Mike Flanagan is doing. He did the Haunting at Hill House series on Netflix. It's probably one of the most notable things he's done. M. Night Shyamalan. He incorporates a lot of aspects of faith into his work. Um, Signs is a good example of that.
Signs is a very Christian movie.
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. Those are a few to get us started here.
Well, that's cool. Yeah, and it's really cool because Matheson wrote the I Am Legend, which was in that book. It was vampires,
Yeah,
but it's a type of resurrection, of course. But what's interesting is that book would then lead to basically the creator of The Walking Dead just to rip it off. Not the creator of The Walking Dead, the Night of the Living Dead,
yeah,
to rip it off. He's even said, "I was just doing I Am Legend, just made them into zombies," and so
yeah,
that really helped launch the whole entire zombie genre. Which
yeah,
to me, as a kid, and I still feel that is the scariest genre. That's the only thing would have nightmares about. So I always was thinking about zombie apocalypses. And then when The Walking Dead came out, of course,
yeah,
I was really into that program for a long time. But again, this all comes back to this idea of almost like there's this Western Christian idea of what horror is. There's something about Western horror that, when I say Western, like Christian is Western, that makes it unique to other horror genres because it has this really strong, deep impact of blood,
yeah,
resurrection, um, trying to defeat death, but also Christianity is about the defeat of death, but then it's almost like there's like this evil version of resurrection, which is really what all Christianity is about. That is a counterfeit, and it
yeah,
just goes to show that if you try to play God, then there's going to be disasters,
yeah,
and that seems to always be the underlying theme of so many horror movies.
yeah. Frankenstein is that exact thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking there's this because there is horror that it definitely glorifies gore, and I can definitely see why people have problems with that. But
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times when people think of horror, maybe from looking from the outside, they think horror is just that. But there's so much more to the horror genre. There's so much more, subgenres and things to explore. And so that's just one small aspect of horror.
Well, and that's true. And this is the other thing we talked about earlier off camera was how so much of the imagery of the horror that we see that's really just like intensely like we could talk about Hellraiser and just these
Yeah,
horrifying just creatures and these ugly images. They really are taking their influence directly from what the paintings of hell that were put in Catholic churches in Europe. I mean, if
yeah,
you want to look at horror, just look
yeah,
at depictions of hell in the churches in Europe and the art that was used.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of horror that's if we look at slashers, these are very staple parts of the horror genre. Halloween, Friday the 13th, stuff like that. They're built around this idea that if you do certain things, which society as a whole kind of frowns upon, you're going to get punished. Like, for example, if you have sex in a horror movie, that's the classic trope. You're going to get
Right.
punished for that, and that's a very Christian, moralistic idea.
You commit any of the
Yeah,
seven deadly sins in the slasher film in the
yeah,
80s, you're dead.
yep, exactly.
Yeah, that's so cool. And just one thing I want to talk a little bit about too, folks, is that there is some of you, especially evangelical audience, is going to be familiar with Frank Peretti, who wrote the best-selling series This Present Darkness, which he is called the Stephen King of evangelical Christianity. Sold millions of copies of his This Present Darkness series in the 90s. It's still a perpetual seller. And that just isn't another example of just because it's part of it's something scary and it deals with the supernatural, you shouldn't necessarily be afraid of it. And also, just the utility of horror movies can actually be helpful to people. Being scared and that adrenaline rush you get can also be fun. It's part of growing up, also, too. As kids, you're so afraid of things, and horror movies are kind of one of those ways to kind of work out maybe your fear of death or things like that, where and so they can be scary in the same way that a roller coaster ride can be scary, but they can also be part of the growth process of you becoming an adult. Does that make any sense to you?
It makes sense to me. Yeah, and thank you for turning me on to Frank Peretti. I'm definitely gonna have to check him out. But yeah, exactly. That's death is a part of our world, right? And that's something that some people may choose to try and ignore, but that's something that I'm working to accept and explore in my writing. And this idea that we're in this world to we're going to face darkness, in our lives in some degree. Everyone has trials that they're going to have to pass through and overcome, and this idea that we all have to face these monsters, whatever form they take, and try and overcome them. Um, working through faith. Christ overcame the greatest darkness of death, which is something that he's the only one who's ever done that, and that's something that as Christians we celebrate and uh, worship, and that's something that I hope comes across in this book and in my work.
Well, interesting. And so, like, one of the more famous verses in the Book of Mormon is called the opposition in all things, which is
Yeah,
a kind of a unique Mormon idea, and that can just talk about the whole good evil dichotomy, which is kind of like what we'd said earlier, is very important in the horror genre, which makes it so unique. There's an acknowledgement from all these horror writers that there is the existence of evil,
yeah,
and that permeates the entire story. But there's also the existence of good, and there's so an opposition going on, this cosmic, divine cosmic battle that is represented in this genre.
absolutely. There's one of my favorite bands. It's a little indie band from Long Island, but they're called Brand New, and one of their albums is called "The Devil and God is Raging Inside Me." And I love that title, and I love that idea that we're all kind of caught in the middle of this push and pull relationship. And obviously, as Christians, we want to side with God, but there's always this struggle, and that's something that I think is really interesting to explore. Every story is kind of about that, anyways, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, hey, I want you to maybe talk a little bit about your background.
Yeah,
Just tell us a little bit about yourself, Derek.
yeah. I was raised a member of the LDS Church. I'm from New England originally, currently living in Utah. I am the oldest of 10 children, so
Wow.
classic Mormon family there. But yeah, I mean, I've always I had that classic millennial origin story, I guess, as far as being a horror writer goes, where I grew up in a religious household, so we weren't really exposed to it. I would have to like sneak episodes of the show called Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon
Oh
while my
yeah.
parents were out of the room. Started reading the Goosebumps books, and I don't know, it's something I've thought about a lot, and it's hard to explain, why you like horror, but it's just I've always found it so fascinating. I think part of it is the stakes. The stakes are just so high in horror, and that just keeps me interested and engaged. If the characters are if death is on the line, it's just amped up to 11.
Mm.
Do you have any specific questions you want to know about me or?
Oh well, just like your where'd you serve your mission? Just off the top.
Yeah, I served in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Okay, okay. So you
Yeah,
speak Portuguese pretty
I,
good.
I did. It's probably not as good as I used to, but yeah, I can hold a small conversation.
And you had mentioned you were lived in California for a while, but now you
Yeah,
relocated to Utah.
yeah.
You had mentioned that you still trying to pursue the film aspect of your like doing script writing and all that kind of stuff?
I am. I haven't been writing as many scripts lately. I've been focusing more on this, just books and short stories and stuff like that. But I am actively trying to make connections here in Utah. Um, that is still a
And
goal.
I'm just curious, like what kind of have you been getting any pushback? Like when you first told people I'm writing this Mormon horror novella,
Mhm.
did people kind of look at you like, I don't know about that? What kind of pushback did you get?
Um, I can't say that I've received active pushback from that idea because usually I'll follow that up with saying, but it's a faithful um, you know, story. My goal here is to tell a story about a faithful, believing LDS person in the horror genre, and usually people are like, "Oh, interesting." Um, we'll see. We'll see how interesting people think it really is. As the story gets out there, if they really are interested in reading it or not. This is kind of all an experiment. Um, but yeah, if people are interested in learning more about Mormon and the relationship between Mormonism and horror, I'm not actually the first person to ever try it. There's a group called the Association of Mormon Letters, and they actually just did an article about kind of the history of Mormon horror, and it was kind of
Oh,
actually a response to because I did an interview with the Tribune about this novella a
okay.
few weeks ago, and it's kind of a response to that. But if you go on their website, you should be able to get some more ideas and names about people who have maybe
Okay.
written.
Oh, and I did want to ask you just a famous. We got a horror genre and Mormonism. We got to talk about Twilight.
Yeah, yeah,
What do you have to say about that series? I never got into it, so I really don't know much about it. But I
yeah.
know there's
I
definitely Mormon.
I've watched the first one
Mhm.
um, with my wife. My wife's a big fan. The ladies really seem to love it for whatever reason. I know I'm a big Guillermo del Toro fan, and he's kind of bashed on it. um, but there are definitely Mormon themes in there. The idea of chastity and the idea of this sexual temptation, eternal life. There's definitely a lot of LDS themes in there. But it's definitely kind of a softer version of the stuff that I like. So
Okay, got it,
amps up
got
the romance.
it. So
Yeah,
you're a big Del Toro fan. What's
yeah.
your favorite movie that he made?
Um, it's a. I mean, I think his best movie is Pan's Labyrinth. But my favorite to go back and watch is called Crimson Peak, which came out just a few years ago. It's
Okay,
kind of like
Crimson
a
Peak.
gothic ghost story.
Okay, yeah, I've been meaning to check out Pan's Labyrinth. I
Yeah,
always thought that. Okay, and then so we're talking about. I was going to ask you a question about another horror movie. Oh, M Night Shyamalan.
yeah.
Signs was a really good movie. Uh, what's your favorite M Night Shyamalan movie?
I'm probably gonna get some flack for this, but I really like The Village, which I
Oh,
know
that's
a lot of
interesting.
people have issues with.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
Well, there was parts of it I really loved, but I really
yeah.
feel like the ending was a disaster because they revealed too much too soon. That was the big
Mhm.
reveal happened too soon in the movie, and then it took away all the tension. That was my biggest criticism of it. It's
Yeah.
that I felt like they revealed the real story when the
Mhm.
girl is still encountering this creature, and we now know
Right.
it's not. And it's like, yeah, I took away up until that point. I was really into it.
Yeah.
I thought it was a cool. And of course, M. Night Shyamalan has the reputation of being a very uneven director.
Yeah,
He has since made a comeback and has come out with some pretty good films. I liked, Sixth Sense, of course.
yeah.
I mean, going into it not knowing anything, man. That was just really an awesome film. And so yeah, I'm not like a major horror person,
Mhm.
but I do engage it. I do dabble with it. I do kind
Yeah.
of see what's out there and kind of try to stay connected to it. As a matter of fact, the very first rated R movie I ever saw, and that was cool, so cool because I'm 14 years old and I'm hanging out with my older friends who are like 19, and we went to go see Friday the 13th Part 4.
Wow.
And I thought it was such a big. Of course, I was freaking out
Rebel.
because what's that?
You rebel.
Yes, I know. It's such a rebel. I know. And that was my first rated R movie. I thought that was so cool. So that's my story
Yeah.
about my encounters with horrors and horror movies. I just wanted to ask you, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about in regard to horror movies, your book, anything else you want to talk about your book about as well?
I don't think so, but I did want to just build off what you just said. There's a lot of people out there like you, Stephen, that horror fandom, I guess you could say, exists on the spectrum where there's hardcore horror fans, and then there's people who will never read a horror book, and then there's people who are somewhere along that spectrum in the middle. My hope is that with this, because it is, about a story about faith, and it's a story, I try to keep it as tame as I could. I mean, it's probably sits at about a PG-13 rating if I had to rate it on the movie system, but I'm hoping that I can draw some of the people that maybe dabble in horror occasionally, um, to read this, because it is different from, kind of some of the stuff you mentioned that just kind of celebrates the gore and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and that kind of, not all genres are for everyone. I
yeah,
always tell people I don't judge people for the books and the movies and the TV shows they watch because it's a very subjective
yeah,
thing. I try not to. I mean, there are some really stuff I see on TV and like I don't know how anybody could watch this, and millions of people are watching it. I will never in a million years watch it, so I guess I'm kind of critical in
mhm,
that way. But generally speaking, I try to, because I know a lot of Christians that are very judgmental, like, well, you read Stephen King, oh, what kind of Christian are you, or and it's almost like, um, well, there's a lot of, if you just actually open up the Bible and even the Book of Mormon,
yep,
there's a lot of violence.
yes,
There's a lot of scary things that happen in these books as well. As a matter of fact, if we were to make a movie that literally depicted the events of the Old Testament, it would be considered a horror movie. It'd be rated R. But also we have the very famous movie made by Mel Gibson, um, The Passion of the Christ,
yep,
and that was, just so you know, folks, The Passion of the Christ for at least like 10, 15 years was the highest grossing rated R movie of all time,
yeah,
and it doesn't get much more gory than that. And so it's odd to me that you're going to go after people for even the gore. Really, when you think about it, like how how much gorier does it get than the Passion of the Christ, right?
yeah, yeah. And the sequel's coming,
Yeah, I
and
know.
the highest grossing horror movie to this day is the original Exorcist movie. So
Another Christian film.
religion horror, yeah,
So that's the key thing. So that's what this story was about. Now, I just also wanted to talk a little bit just historically. Now, some people say, "Oh, why are you doing this Halloween?" Well, I also want to acknowledge that October 31st is also Reformation Day, which is an important day on the Christian calendar to acknowledge the role that the reformers played in basically dismantling, helping dismantle an authoritarian church and in giving us really ultimately the Western civilization, democracy. Of course, the Catholics played a role in that too. I'm not going to poo-poo them because I love Catholics, but it actually helped reinvigorate Europe and also helped in the formation of our republic. So let's honor Reformation Day as well on Halloween. You have any words on
yes,
that too, dude?
I love it. No, exactly. Let's honor them. Let's celebrate them, because they were men just trying to follow God and follow their consciences and do what was right. So they definitely deserve our respect and admiration.
Absolutely. So Derek, it's so cool. I did a Christmas special last year, a Thanksgiving special, and then we started thinking, let's do a Halloween special this year. I want to thank you so much for coming on today, dude.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun to talk about this.
So I just want to remind all of you that I have links in the description so that you can purchase the Resurrection box and you can get it on Amazon. Also, I want to remind you that if you'd like to support the channel, there will be links in the description to support the channel via PayPal as well as Patreon. And of course, don't forget the merch store, Mormon Book Reviews. And we got t-shirts and mugs and got mouse pads, you name it. And so if you want to support the channel by buying some of our merch, we would greatly appreciate that as well. And just remember, folks, the most important thing is all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.